Hi, I'm Stan Shelley from Shelley & Son Books in North Carolina. This is one of our videos for the series called About Old Books. The first thing I have to do is make a couple corrections about last week's video. Last week we talked about Oz books, Wizard of Oz books, and I made two mistakes. I mentioned a map that came out in 1920 in the books, and I said that it was a fourfold. In reality, it was a twofold. Then I gave a good guideline that any Oz book from 1934 or earlier, if it did not have color plates, it was not a first edition. There's one exception to that. The book Road to Oz in 1909, the first edition does not have color plates in it. So that's the exception to that rule. So this week we're talking about the book 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and it was published first in France in 1869 and 70. It was published serially, that means in monthly magazines. Then when they were done with that in 1870, they published the book. So the first edition is in French, 1870. A man named Louis Mercier translated it into English, and then the first English edition came out from Great Britain in 1872. That translation goes down in history as one of the worst translations ever. The translator left out about 20 to 25% of the book and didn't even include it in the English translation. What he did translate had hundreds of mistakes in it. So that translation lives in infamy. But nonetheless, 1872, the first British edition came out. 1873, the first American edition came out. In 1873, it was published by Osgood. But there's a real interesting turn right here. Osgood printed the books in the late 1872 year, and they were going to distribute them in 1873. There was a big Boston fire. All the books almost were lost. Very, very few survived. So the first American edition, it's been estimated there's only 15 to 20 copies of the first American edition, and there's been a few in the auctions recently. That might be a little low, but it might be 20 or 30 copies. But it's still extremely rare. If you happen to have one your grandmother passed down, if you sell it, there's a chance you'll get over $5,000 for it. That first edition is so rare. I'm going to tell you how to identify the first from the second edition, because before 1873 was over, another publisher, George Smith, came out with what is the second edition, but what actually most collectors try to collect, because the first edition is unfindable. So they collect the second edition by George Smith. First of all, how do you know if you have a first edition? Three ways. On the title page, it'll say Osgood. That's straightforward enough. But even before you open it, you can tell from the front cover, this circle on the first edition has jellyfish instead of Captain Nemo. I'm holding the second edition, and it has Captain Nemo, but the first edition has jellyfish there. And also, the first edition says Under the Sea. It doesn't say Under the Seas. There's confusion about what the title of the book is because of that guy that translated it into English. In French, it's definitely seas plural, because the idea is Captain Nemo sailed the seven seas. The translator kind of switched the seas to being the ocean or the sea singular, and so in English the title has become 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But the first couple editions, that was unclear. So the first edition says Under the Sea singular. The second edition says seas plural, and most editions thereafter went back to sea singular. Now, if you have a first edition, it might be green like this, it might be blue, and it might be red. All those have been found among the very few copies that are out there. If you have a second edition, it will say George Smith on the title page. It'll have Captain Nemo in the circle. It'll say Under the Seas here. It'll say 1873. If it says 74 or later, then it's a later printing. has to say 1873 to be a second edition, and as far as I know, they're all green. There's no other colors. Now, one interesting thing about the second edition is that there are two variations of it, the first variation and the second variation. So this book is a second American edition, first variation. The variations have to do with the last page. If the last page has the end on it, and I don't know if we can focus well enough on it, but you can see that you can barely even read that because the type was breaking up. And so eventually the type got so bad they just removed it. So the first variation has the end, the second variation does not have the end. And in this case I have the first variation, but you can see that it's breaking up, and we can understand why they're going to remove the end from the end. So that's the first and second edition, American edition of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I just want to make two other comments. When I got this copy, it was in bad condition. This whole spine was off, the back was off. So I sent it and had it professionally restored. They did a great job putting a leather spine on it. They put a new back on it. But to a collector, even as nice as this leather spine is, that's a negative. The collector would rather have the original spine on it. He'd rather have the original back on it, even if it was worn. So that's a couple tips about what collectors want. So that's it for 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Next week we're going to talk about modern library books, because I want people to understand, whatever your budget, there's books you can collect. This is an expensive book, but modern library books are very inexpensive, and you can collect them a dozen different ways, and they're quite inexpensive, and they're a lot of fun. So we'll talk about them next week. If you have questions, write at shellyandsunbooks@gmail.com, or you can go to our website. I said gmail.com. Is that correct? Yeah. shellyandsunbooks@gmail.com is the email address. The website is shellyandsunbooks.com. So, see you next week.